The bottle caught the light when it left his hand. I moved right, and it hit the wall where my head had been. Glass and whiskey. The bar erupted. 2 men came over the counter, and I went under it, came up on the other side, found the door by feel, and pushed through into Texas's heat that hit harder than anyone inside had managed. Boots on dry ground behind me. I ran. Sometimes that's the whole plan, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Pull up that chair. The office is quiet tonight, and the rain's doing its usual work on the window. I want to tell you about a bar in a town called Redwell, out past the edge of what most maps bother with. I went there on a job and found something I wasn't hired to find, which in my experience is how the interesting cases always go. Settle in. This one takes a minute to build. Pam handed me the file on a Thursday. She'd flagged 3 things in red, which is her system for items she considers essential and I consider alarming. She said a lawyer named Cooper had called from Texas, retained by a land development firm with interests in Redwell County. A man named Sutter had vanished. He had been sent to Redwell 6 weeks prior to assess a property. He had sent 1 report, then stopped communicating entirely. Cooper wanted him found. Pam had already booked the train. She does that when she's decided I'm going regardless of what I say, which is most of the time. She told me Redwell had a population of roughly 400, 1 main street, a church, a feed store, and a saloon called the Dusty Mile that had apparently appeared in town sometime in the last 2 years, she said. Appeared with deliberate word choice. Nobody she'd reached by telephone could say exactly when it had opened. That detail sat with me all the way to Texas. The train ride was long and flat and gave me time to read Cooper's file on Sutter. 43 years, old, experienced field assessor, known for thorough work and reliable reports. The single report he'd filed from Redwell described the property as viable, but noted in a brief final paragraph that certain local conditions required further examination before he could recommend proceeding. He hadn't specified the conditions. That final paragraph had the feeling of a man choosing words carefully, because he wasn't sure who might read them first. Redwell arrived the way. Small Texas towns arrive. Gradually. Then, all at once, a water tower and some rooftops, and then a main street baking under afternoon sun that had no interest in subtlety. I checked into the only rooming house run by a woman named Mrs. Hatch, who asked no questions and provided a room with a window facing the street, which I requested specifically. From that window I could see the Dusty Mile directly. Low building, rough timber, a sign that looked newer than it wanted to appear. I asked Mrs. Hatch about the saloon over coffee that evening. She was a careful woman, the kind who measures words before spending them, she said. The Dusty Mile had been there as long as she could recall, then corrected herself and said perhaps 2 years, then said she wasn't certain, and changed the subject to the quality of the summer's heat, which was considerable and a safer topic. Her uncertainty seemed genuine. What struck me was that she seemed genuinely uncertain, not evasive. She truly did not know when the saloon had appeared. I tried the feed store owner the next morning. Same result. The man had lived in Redwell for 30 years and could not tell me with confidence whether the Dusty Mile had been there for 1 year or 3. He remembered a time without it and a time with it, but couldn't locate the transition. He seemed mildly troubled by this gap when I drew his attention to it, as though he'd never thought to connect the 2 periods, and found the space between them strange once he looked directly at it. I called Pam from the rooming house telephone that evening. She had been working the Redwell property records and had found something that required the tone she uses when findings exceed expectations. The land parcel that Cooper's firm wanted assessed had changed hands 3 times in 18 months, each transfer at a price significantly below assessed value. Each buyer accompanied that dissolved within weeks of the purchase. The current title holder was a firm with no public officers and an address in a state neither of us found convincing. She said one more thing before signing off. The Dusty Mile had no business registration in Redwell County. No liquor license on record in the state, no property deed under that name, or any name matching its location on the main street. For official purposes, the building did not exist, which is a considerable achievement for a structure you can see from a rooming house window. She said it calmly. I found it less calming. I thanked her and went to bed, and lay listening to the Texas night and the sound of the Dusty Mile across the street doing steady business. I went into the Dusty Mile the following afternoon. The best time to study a room is when it's half full, which is when people are settled enough to behave naturally and sparse, enough that you can see the whole space. The interior was long and dim, the kind of dim that isn't accidental. Timber walls, a bar running the length of the left side, tables filling the rest, a man behind the bar, who had the careful stillness of someone paid to observe rather than converse. I ordered whiskey and took a table near the wall with a sight line to the door and the bar both, which is a preference I've developed through situations that rewarded it. The whiskey was good, better than the town suggested it should be, which was a small detail that joined the list I was maintaining. Good whiskey in an unlicensed bar in a town of 400 that couldn't remember when the place had opened. The list was getting texture, if not yet direction. The bartender's name was Cole. I learned this from a conversation between two locals that I absorbed without appearing to. Cole spoke only when spoken to and answered questions with the minimum words required, a technique I respect professionally and found unhelpful personally. He watched the room the way men watch rooms when the room is the thing they are actually employed to protect. Not the bar, not the drinks, the room itself and whatever the room contained that required watching. I stayed 2 hours. In that time I counted 4 men who entered, conducted brief exchanges with Cole, and left without ordering anything. Not conversations exactly. Exchanges. The kind where information moves in one direction and acknowledgement moves in the other. One of the 4 carried an envelope. He arrived with it and left without it, and Cole moved it below the bar, with the practiced motion of a man for whom this was routine. The Dusty Mile was doing business, just not the business on the sign. I asked Cole about a man named Sutter, describing him from the photograph Cooper had included in the file. Cole said he didn't know the name, said it without pause, which meant either he genuinely didn't know or the name had been anticipated and prepared for. I had thanked him and left and stood on the main street in the afternoon heat and thought about the difference between those two options. A man either knows a name or he doesn't. The speed of the answer doesn't tell you which. The eyes sometimes do. Coles had told me nothing useful. I went back to the rooming house and found a note under my door. No envelope, no signature. 4 words in a plain hand. Leave before it's dark. I held the note and looked at it with the attention you give something. That has crossed a line from information into instruction. Someone in Redwell knew I was asking questions. Someone had decided the questions were a problem, that they had communicated through a note rather than directly suggested either caution or a preference for deniability. Neither interpretation made the note less serious. I called Pam again, told her about the note, the envelope under the bar, the 4 men, Cole's prepared denial of Sutter's name. She listened without interrupting. Then she said she had found a reference to Sutter in a county incident report filed 5 weeks ago. He had been stopped on a road outside Redwell by a local deputy on an unspecified matter and released without charges. After that date, nothing. She said the deputy's name was Crane. She said it the way she says names. She wants me to remember. Deputy Crane was not difficult to find. In a town of 400, the sheriff's office was a single room attached to the building that also housed the post office, which said something about the county's administrative priorities. Crane was inside, a lean man, in his late 30s, with the watchful economy of someone who has learned that small towns require careful management. He acknowledged Sutter's name without the prepared speed Cole had used. He said Sutter had passed through, asked questions about the land parcel, and moved on. He said moved on with careful neutrality. I asked where Sutter had been staying. Crane said he hadn't been registered at the rooming house, which I could verify and which was true. I had already checked. I asked if he had stayed elsewhere. Crane thought about this for a moment, too long, then said not to his knowledge. The moment too long was small, but present. A man who knows his town completely does not pause over the question of where a visitor slept. He pauses when the answer has an inconvenient address. I thanked Crane and left and noted his expression. As I went, it had the texture of relief. I ate at the diner across from the rooming house and thought about Redwell, a saloon with no registration, no license, no deed, a bartender who handled envelopes and denied names at prepared speed, a deputy who paused over a simple question, a development assessor who had stopped communicating after noting unspecified local conditions, and a note under my door from someone who knew I was here and wanted me gone. Before dark, the town had the surface of a quiet place and the undertow of something that had been carefully arranged to stay quiet. Those two things together are never accidental. After dinner I walked the perimeter of Redwell in the last of the daylight, which, in Texas at that time of year, gives you more time than you expect and better light than you deserve. I was mapping the town the way I do when I need to understand a place as a physical thing rather than a social one. Streets, buildings, open ground, sight lines. The Dusty Mile sat at the center of the main street, but its rear faced a service alley that connected to a road heading north, a road with recent tire tracks pressed into the dry dirt. The tracks were from a vehicle heavier than a standard automobile, something with width and weight, the kind that moves cargo rather than passengers. They came from the north road, ran behind the Dusty Mile, and returned the same way, recent enough that the edges hadn't crumbled in the heat. I followed them north on foot for a quarter mile until the road curved behind a rise and I lost the light entirely. I went back. The Dusty Mile was full and lit and conducting its visible business without apparent concern for anyone examining its perimeter. I wrote a detailed letter to Pam that evening and posted it at the box outside the post office before the 10 o'clock collection. In it, I laid out everything I had observed and asked her to research the North Road out of Redwell. Any properties or structures registered along it at any transport company operating in Redwell County whose vehicle weight matched what the tracks suggested. I told her to contact Cooper and advise him to make no further communication through the Redwell telephone exchange until I said otherwise. I had no evidence the exchange was monitored. It was the kind of precaution that feels excessive until it isn't. That night someone tried the handle of my room door at approximately 2 in the morning. A single attempt, firm but quiet, the kind that tests rather than forces. I was awake. I had been awake since 11 with the particular alertness that a note slid under a door tends to produce. I stayed still and watched the handle, and it didn't move again. Footsteps retreating down the hallway, then the stairs. By the time I reached the window, the street below was empty. The Dusty Mile across the road was dark. Even unlicensed establishments close eventually. Morning brought clarity of the Texas variety, which is absolute and merciless, and begins earlier than you are prepared for. I went back to the North Road on foot before the town was fully awake, carrying water and the patience that fieldwork requires, and never fully rewards. The road curved north for nearly a mile before I found what the tracks were going to. A low structure set back from the road, timber, and corrugated iron, large enough to be a warehouse, and deliberate enough in its positioning to avoid the sight line from Redwell's main street. No signs, no visible windows on the road-facing side. A single door with a padlock that was newer and heavier than anything else on the building. Around the left side, a loading dock with a ramp wide, enough for the vehicle whose tracks I had followed. The ground around the dock was marked with the layered impressions of repeated use. This was not an occasional operation. Whatever moved through. This building moved regularly and in quantity. I stood at the edge of the tree cover and looked at it and thought about the dusty mile and its envelopes and its bartender who watched rooms. I went around the right side of the structure and found what I was looking for without expecting to find it so directly. A window, small and high, with the latch visibly corroded in the open position. Old damage, not recent. The kind of detail that gets added to a maintenance list and never reached. I found a crate near the loading dock, moved it below the window, and went in with the economy of movement that narrow windows demand, and that my jacket did not fully survive. Inside was dim and large, and smelled of timber, machine oil, and paper. Paper in quantity. Crates along the walls, open, filled with documents. Not loose papers, bound files, organized with tabs and labels, the kind of organization that suggests volume and permanence. I moved along the nearest row and read the tabs in the available light. Names, dates, property, coordinates. The coordinates were for Redwell County land parcels. The names on the tabs were companies. Different names, different states of registration, but the filing format was identical across all of them. Someone had been producing documentation for land transactions that hadn't happened through any legitimate channel. I recognized. I found Sutter's name on a file near the end of the third row. Not a property file, a personnel file, thin, containing his photograph, his professional background, the name of Cooper's firm, and a single handwritten note describing his arrival date in Redwell, and his inquiry into the North Road property. The note ended with a line that took me a moment to process fully. It said, "Contained, pending, resolution." Two words that do not mean the same thing in a personnel file as they do in a property file. I put the file back exactly as I found it and moved toward the window. I didn't make it to the window. The door opened before I reached the crate I'd used to climb in, and two men entered with the purposeful entry of people who had been told someone was in their building, and had arrived to address that fact. They were large in the practical, rather than the decorative sense, and they moved to cover the space between me and the window with a coordination suggesting they had managed similar situations before. I stood in the middle of the warehouse floor and looked at them, and they looked at me, and the morning outside continued without us for a moment. The larger of the two spoke first. He told me to stay where I was in the tone of someone who considers compliance the only reasonable response to his suggestions. I stayed where I was, which was not compliance so much as calculation. The warehouse had one door, one compromised window, and two men positioned between me and both. The crates along the walls were the only variable in a room that otherwise offered nothing useful. I looked at the crates and they looked at me, and the calculation continued. The smaller one moved toward me while the larger held the door, a practical arrangement that would have worked better if the floor between us had been clear. It was not clear. The crates along the center row had been pulled out during what I assumed was a recent inventory, leaving a gap that redirected his approach by 2 steps to the right. 2 steps is a meaningful interval when you have decided that the space on the left is where you need to be. I moved left when he moved right and reached the nearest wall before he finished adjusting. What the wall had that I needed was a length of chain hanging from a pulley, System mounted to the ceiling beam, the industrial variety used for moving heavy crates. Not a weapon exactly. A weight with reach, which is a functional substitute in a warehouse with limited options. I took it off. Its hook and the larger man at the door made his own calculation and found it unsatisfying. He called something to the smaller man who was still navigating the crate. Gap. I used the interval their communication created and moved toward the window side. The smaller man was faster than his navigation of the crates had suggested. He came around the last crate with a speed that reduced my interval considerably and required me to make the chain useful sooner than planned. It was useful. He disagreed with it briefly and then sat down against the crate with the resigned posture of someone whose participation in the morning had reached its limit. The larger man at the door made a sound that combined surprise and intention and came off the door toward me. I was already moving toward the door he'd just vacated. I went through it into the Texas morning and ran north along the tree line, rather than back toward Redwell, which was the direction they would expect, and the direction that led back to a town where I now understood my presence was actively managed. The larger man came through the door behind me and ran, with the sustained effort of someone in reasonable condition and considerable motivation. I had a head start and the advantage of having chosen a direction he hadn't anticipated. After 3 minutes, the footsteps behind me lost their consistency. After 5, they stopped. I circled back toward Redwell through open ground that the tree line eventually gave way to, approaching the rooming house from the south rather than the main street. Mrs. Hatch was in the kitchen and received my appearance through the back door with the particular composure of a woman who has seen enough in a rooming house to be difficult to genuinely surprise. I told her I needed to use the telephone and would be leaving before noon. She said she would prepare a bill. We understood each other without further discussion. Pamela answered before the second ring. She had received my letter and anticipated the call, which meant she had already acted on the contents, which meant the conversation was going to be more advanced than I had prepared for. She said the North Road out of Redwell had one registered. Structure on it listed as agricultural storage. Registered to a company that shared its registered agent with 2 of the dissolved firms from the land title transfers. The same agent, the same paperwork architecture. The warehouse was not a separate operation. It was the engine of the entire arrangement. The land transfers, the dissolved companies, the files in the warehouse. It was a fabrication system, creating paper histories for properties that allowed them to be sold and resold at manipulated values, generating the documentation that made fraudulent transactions appear legitimate. The Dusty Mile was the coordination point. The envelopes Cole received were instructions and payments. Deputy Crane was the local accommodation that kept official attention directed elsewhere. And the property Cooper's firm wanted to assess sat at the center of it, which was why Sutter's arrival had been noted and managed. I asked Pam about Sutter. She said she had been working on that specifically. A man, matching his description, had been seen at a motor lodge 12 miles east of Redwell, registered under a different name as of 4 days ago. She had reached the lodge by telephone. The registration was still active. Either Sutter was there voluntarily under a name not his own, or he was there involuntarily under a name chosen for him. The distinction mattered, and could only be resolved by going there. She told me to be careful. I told her I was always careful. The pause she gave that statement was brief and expressive. I settled with Mrs. Hatch and left through the back and moved south through Redwell on streets that avoided the main road and the Dusty Miles sightline. At the southern edge of town I found a man with a truck and a willingness to drive east in exchange for an amount that surprised him favorably. We didn't talk much. Texas roads at midday discourage conversation the way heat discourages most things requiring effort. I watched the flat country go by and thought about a warehouse full of fabricated documents, and a saloon that had appeared in a town without anyone noticing it arrive. The motor lodge 12 miles east of Redwell was the kind of place that exists to be difficult to find and easy to leave. 8 units arranged in a shallow arc, a gravel lot, a small office with a screen door that made its presence known in the dry wind. The man at the desk received me with the minimal hospitality of someone whose business model does not depend on making guests feel welcome. I asked about the registration Pam had identified. He confirmed it without enthusiasm and pointed to Unit 6. I knocked on Unit 6 with the knock. That isn't aggressive, but communicates intention. A long pause, then the sound of someone moving carefully inside. The way people move when they're deciding whether the knock is the kind that requires answering. I said Cooper's name through the door. Another pause, shorter. Then the latch turned and the door opened 3 inches, and an eye appeared in the gap with the specific wariness of someone who has been careful for several weeks, and has not yet decided if careful is still enough. Sutter looked like his photograph with 5 weeks of difficulty applied on top. He was alive and functional and in full possession of his judgment, which he applied immediately to assessing me through the 3-inch gap before opening the door fully. He had been in Unit 6 for 11 days. Before that, he had been held for 18 days in the warehouse on the North Road, in a back room I had not reached during my visit that morning. He said held with the flat accuracy of someone describing a fact they have had time to process into something manageable. He had gotten out 11 days ago through a combination of patience and the corroded window latch, which I received with the mild satisfaction of a detail that connects. The same window I had used that morning had been Sutter's exit weeks earlier. He had reached the motor lodge on foot over 2 days, moving at night, and had stayed because he had the contents of 1 file from the warehouse, committed to memory and needed to get it to someone before deciding his next move. He had not contacted Cooper because he did not trust the Redwell telephone exchange. His caution and my caution had arrived independently at the same conclusion. The file he had memorized was the operational record of the fabrication. System, names, dates, transaction amounts, the identity of the man who ran it from above the level of Cole and Crane, and the 2 men in the warehouse. Not a Redwell local. A man based in the city who had constructed the operation over 4 years. Using the Dusty Mile as a coordination hub and Redwell's isolation as a structural advantage. A town small enough that new arrivals could be managed and quiet enough that managed meant invisible to anyone not looking carefully from inside it. The man's name was Algerd, no first name in the file, just Algerd, which Sutter said appeared consistently across all the operational records he had seen. He was the registered agent for several of the dissolved companies, using variations of credentials that were real enough to pass initial examination and built on a foundation that dissolved when pressed. Sutter had pressed. That was why he had been contained pending resolution. I used the motor lodge telephone to call Pam and gave her Algerd and the operational details Sutter provided. She absorbed them in silence and said she would have a full identity by evening. I told her to contact Cooper directly and advise him to bring the file to a federal authority rather than state, given that Craney's accommodation suggested the local level was compromised. She agreed and added that she had already drafted a summary for Cooper's review, pending my confirmation. I said I hadn't confirmed anything yet. She said she was aware of that. I asked Sutter if he could travel. He said he had been traveling on 2 days of water and no sleep 11 days ago, and had managed adequately, so yes, he believed he could manage with a vehicle. I arranged passage back toward the city through the truck driver, who was still waiting at the motor lodge lot, with the patient disengagement of a man being paid by the hour and finding it agreeable. Sutter took 10 minutes to collect what little he had in. Unit 6. I used the 10 minutes to stand outside and watch the eastern road for anything moving toward us with purpose. Nothing came from the east. What came was from the direction of Redwell, which is where I should have been watching. A single vehicle moving at the speed of intention rather than transit, raising a pale line of dust on the dry road. It reached the motor lodge lot before the truck driver had finished his question about where we were headed and settled into a position that blocked the lot exit with the geometric certainty of prior planning. The two doors opened, Cole from the Dusty Mile, and Deputy Crane, out of his jurisdiction and apparently unconcerned by the fact Cole had the same watchful stillness he'd had behind the bar. Translated into open ground without apparent difficulty, Crane had the bearing of a man executing an instruction rather than making a decision, which told me the instruction had come from above him, and that above him meant Algerd. They wanted Sutter. They had tracked him to the motor lodge through a method I could reconstruct later and didn't have time to reconstruct now. The truck driver looked at the situation and arrived at the correct conclusion, which was that it had nothing to do with him and he preferred to keep it that way. Cole spoke first. He told Sutter to get in their vehicle. He said it with the flat economy of someone who has been given a specific instruction and intends to complete it, without elaboration. Sutter stood beside me and said nothing. I said that Sutter was traveling with me, and that the deputy was 12 miles outside his jurisdiction, which Crane acknowledged with a small adjustment of his expression that confirmed he knew it and had decided it was someone else's problem. Men act outside their authority when the authority above them has told them. The rules don't apply today. The truck driver, to his credit, started his engine not to leave, to have it running, which was a practical contribution to a situation he had correctly assessed as one where available options mattered. Cole heard the engine and looked at the truck and made the calculation that the truck represented a variable he hadn't planned for. Variables unsettle. Men following instructions because instructions don't account for variables. His stillness developed a quality of reconsideration. I used that quality the way you use any opening, immediately and without ceremony. I told Crane directly that a federal summary of the Redwell operation had already been filed with an authority whose name I gave him, which was accurate because Pam had confirmed it 20 minutes earlier on the Motor Lodge telephone. I told him the summary included his name, his accommodation of the operation, and the incident report he had filed regarding Sutter 5 weeks ago. His expression went through several positions before settling on something that resembled a man standing in a room where the walls have just moved. Cole watched Crane's expression and drew his own conclusions. Cole was not a man who panicked. He was a man who assessed and adapted, which made him more dangerous than panic, but also more rational. He looked at me and said that whatever had been filed could be unfiled, by which he meant that Algerd had resources sufficient to manage federal attention the way he had managed local attention. He said it as a statement of operational fact rather than a threat, which made it feel more credible than a threat would have. I told him that was possible. I told him it was also possible that it wasn't, and that the difference between those two outcomes was time, and that time was moving in one direction. Crane made the decision before Cole did, which surprised me slightly. He stepped back toward their vehicle with the deliberate movement of a man withdrawing from a commitment he has decided exceeds its value. Cole watched him go with the expression of someone observing a calculation they disagree with but cannot override. Without Crane, the geometry of the lot changed. 2 men blocking an exit becomes 1 man suggesting a preference. I put Sutter in the truck cab and told the driver east, and the truck moved and Cole stood in the lot and watched us go with the stillness he applied to everything. The truck put distance between us and the motor lodge at a rate that felt insufficient for the first 10 minutes, and adequate after that. Sutter sat with his hands on his knees and the careful breathing of someone managing a sustained stress response with limited remaining resources. I watched the road behind us through the wing mirror. Nothing followed. Either Cole had accepted the geometry of the situation, or he was communicating with Aldred and waiting for a revised instruction. Both possibilities required us to cover ground before the revision arrived. I used the drive to take a full account from Sutter of everything he had seen in the warehouse during the 18 days he had been held there. He was a methodical man, precise in the way that field assessors become, when precision is their professional value. And he had spent 11 days in Unit 6 organizing his memory of the warehouse files into a sequence that could be transmitted clearly. He gave it to me in order. I wrote in my notebook at a pace the trucks. Road manners complicated but didn't prevent. By the time we reached the city limits, I had 14 pages. Pam was waiting at the office when we arrived, which she managed by having stayed, rather than leaving, a distinction that meant she had been there since morning on the assumption that the day would produce something requiring immediate attention. She received Sutter with the practical warmth she applies to situations involving people who have been through something difficult and need to be made functional before anything else can happen. Coffee appeared. My 14 pages disappeared into her hands and were read with the speed. She reads everything, which is faster than seems reasonable, and always complete. She said Aldred had a full name and a city address and a professional biography that was real in its surface details and fabricated in its foundation, the same architecture as everything else in the operation. She had forwarded everything to the federal contact along with Sutter's memorized account. The contact had confirmed receipt and indicated that Redwell and its warehouse would receive attention within 48 hours. She said this, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has moved several large pieces into position and is watching the board resolve. I found it satisfying too, which I didn't say because she already knew. I called Cooper and gave him a summary that covered Sutter's condition, the nature of the operation, and the federal involvement now underway. Cooper asked about the land parcel his firm had wanted assessed. I told him the parcel's title history was fabricated, that the transactions surrounding it were fraudulent, and that any development proceeding on the basis of the existing documentation would land his firm inside an investigation rather than on top of a viable property. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked for my bill. At least somebody's priorities were clear. I should have felt the case closing. The federal contact had confirmed action. Sutter was safe. Cooper had his answer. The warehouse on the North Road was 48 hours from becoming someone else's problem in the official sense. But cases that feel closed before they are closed have a way of reminding you of the distinction. I sat in the office that evening with Pam's summary on the desk and the 14 pages of Sutter's account, and the feeling that something in the architecture hadn't been fully examined. I went back through the pages looking for what it was. I found it on page 9. Sutter had noted, during his time in the warehouse, that a second set of files existed behind the first row of crates along the south wall. Files he had not been able to reach or read during his 18 days, because the room where he had been held provided sight lines to the main floor, but not to the south wall specifically. He had mentioned it as an incomplete observation, and moved on. I had written it down and moved on. With him sitting in the office, I stopped moving on and looked at it directly. 2 sets of files in the same warehouse. The first set documented the land fabrication operation. Property transfers, dissolved companies, manufactured histories. What did the second set document? The first set was the mechanism. A mechanism requires a purpose beyond itself. The fabricated land transactions were producing something money-moving through structures that obscured its origin. The second set of files was the most likely record of where that money was going and in what form and to whom. The warehouse was not just the engine. It was the ledger of the entire enterprise. I told Pam what I was thinking. She had already been thinking it, which I should have anticipated. She said the federal contact needed to know about the second set of files specifically, because a raid that secured the visible operation without securing the financial records would produce convictions at the operational level and leave the structure above it intact. Aldred was the name they had, but a name without a money trail is an indictment that stops at the first layer. She said first layer with the precision of someone who knows exactly how many layers there are and finds one insufficient. I called the federal contact directly, using the number Pam had established. Through Cooper's office, the contact was a careful man who spoke in the measured register of someone accustomed to receiving information without betraying what he already knows. I told him about the second set of files and their likely content and their position in the warehouse relative to the first set. He was quiet for a moment that had the texture of a man revising a plan he had considered complete. He said the timeline would move. He said it would move to tonight. He thanked me and ended the call before I could ask anything further. Tonight meant Redwell was going to receive federal attention in the dark rather than in the 48-hour window I had been given earlier, which meant the operations principals had less time than they currently believed they had, which meant Aldred, wherever he was in the city, was operating on an assumption about his available margin that was no longer accurate. Pam pointed out that a man who discovers his margin is gone sometimes. This destroys what he can before the margin closes entirely. Warehouses with crates of paper documents are particularly vulnerable to that kind of reaction. She was describing a risk and proposing nothing. Because proposing nothing is what she does when the proposal she has in mind involves me going somewhere inadvisable. I told her I was going back to Redwell. She said she had known that since page 9 of my notebook. She handed me a road map she had already marked with the route, and the location of the warehouse and a note at the bottom in her handwriting that said "Be back before morning," which functioned simultaneously as an instruction and something else neither of us named. I took the map and went. I drove through the Texas night with the window down and the flat dark of open country on all sides and the marked map on the passenger seat. The road to Redwell was empty in the way that roads at 2 in the morning are empty, which is completely and without apology. I went through the town without stopping and turned north on the road, behind the main street, past the point where Redwell's few lights became irrelevant until the warehouse appeared as a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky, and I cut the headlamps and rolled to a stop at the tree line. The warehouse was lit, not brightly, a single interior light visible. Through the gap at the base of the loading dock door, someone was inside, moving, from the way the light shifted against the gap. I sat in the car, and watched and calculated. The federal operation was moving tonight, but I had no way of knowing when. Tonight meant, in practical terms, the person inside the warehouse was on their own timeline, one that had an endpoint I couldn't determine from the tree line. I got out of the car and moved toward the building the way I had that morning. Quietly, along the right side toward the compromised window. The window was still compromised. I went through it and landed inside on the same crate I had used before, which had not been moved, and stayed still for the 10 seconds it takes a disturbed space to settle back into its ambient sound. The light was at the far end of the warehouse, near the south wall, the second row of files. Someone was going through them with a lamp, and the focused speed of a person extracting specific documents. From this distance and light, I could see the shape of a man, slight, working quickly, moving files from crate to a bag open on the floor beside him. I moved through the warehouse along the wall, using the crate rows as cover, closing the distance in increments that the ambient noise of the building, timber settling, wind on the corrugated roof, absorbed without assistance. The man at the south wall was too focused on the files to monitor the space behind him, which is the operational error of someone who believes they are alone and has stopped checking. I was 15 feet away when the lamp shifted, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was Crane. Not Cole, not one of the two men from the morning. Crane, the deputy, who had backed away from the motor lodge lot with the bearing of a man, withdrawing from a commitment. He had not withdrawn from the commitment. He had withdrawn from the visible confrontation and come here instead, which meant his calculation at the motor lodge had been more sophisticated than it appeared. He had known the federal involvement was real. He had come to the warehouse not to destroy the files, but to take the ones that connected him specifically and leave the rest. A man removing his own name from a record before investigators arrive is a different problem than a man destroying evidence entirely. He was not protecting Algerd. He was protecting Crane, which meant the loyalty that had kept him functional in the operation had a precise limit. And that limit was his own exposure. I stepped out from the crate row and said his name. He turned with the lamp, and for a moment the light was between us and I couldn't read his expression. Then he lowered the lamp, and I could. It had the specific quality of a man who has run out of moves. I told him to put the files back. He looked at the bag on the floor, and at me, and at the bag again, with the calculation of someone weighing an option they already know is gone. Then he put the files back. Not all of them. 2 remained in the bag that he made no move to return, which I noted and allowed for the moment because the moment required, managing carefully. He asked how I had known he would come here. I said I hadn't known it was him specifically. I had known someone would come. He received that with the expression of a man finding cold comfort in not being special. He told me about Algerd without being asked, which is what men do when they have decided that cooperation is the remaining currency and want to establish its value before the market closes. Algerd was in the city, had been there all week managing the operation's financial layer, through a firm that appeared in none of the warehouse documents but whose name Crane knew because he had delivered correspondence to its office on 2 occasions. He gave me the name. It was not the name Pam had identified. It was a layer above the layer we had reached. The operation had one more floor than the federal contact knew about. I told Crane to sit down and stay in the warehouse, and that the people arriving within the next few hours would receive him more favorably if the files were intact and he was present and cooperative than if either condition was absent. He sat. He looked at the bag with the 2 files still in it, and I looked at it too, and he took them out and returned them to the crate with the resigned movement of a man surrendering the last thing he had brought to the negotiation. Then he sat against the south wall, and I moved to the loading dock door and stepped outside to call Pam. The night outside was still, and the road north was empty in both directions. I found a telephone at the Redwell gas station, which was closed but had an outside line that accepted coins. Pam answered immediately, which at 3 in the morning meant she had not slept, which I had expected, and felt the usual compound of gratitude and guilt about. I gave her the firm name Crane had provided, and told her to get it to the federal contact before the Redwell operation was secured. She said she already had the contact's direct line. Of course she did. She told me the federal team was 40 minutes out from Redwell. I told her Crane was in the warehouse in Cooperative and that the second file set was intact. She relayed this to the contact while I waited on the line and came back with confirmation that Crane's cooperation would be formally noted, which was the closest thing to a guarantee the situation offered, and probably more than Crane deserved and less than he feared. I told Pam to go home and sleep. She said she would when she had finished what she was working on. I asked what she was working on. She said my billing summary. At 3 in the morning, I went back to the warehouse and sat across the floor from Crane in the dim, light, and we waited together with the particular silence of two people who have nothing left to negotiate and nowhere else to be. He asked once if I thought the federal contact would honor what I'd told him about cooperation. I said I thought so. He nodded and looked at the floor. I looked at the south wall files and thought about the dusty mile across town, dark and locked, with its bar, and its envelopes, and its bartender, who was presumably somewhere in the night making his own calculations about morning. The federal team arrived in 3 vehicles at 4:15, moving with the organized efficiency of people who have planned an approach and are executing it without improvisation. They secured the warehouse and its contents in cranes simultaneously, which they managed without requiring my participation or apparently finding my presence surprising, which suggested Pam's communication had been thorough. I gave a statement to the agent in charge, a woman named Driscoll, who asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a notebook smaller than mine. She thanked me and told me I was free to leave Redwell. I didn't leave Redwell immediately. Old habit. When a case breaks open in a specific place, I find it useful to watch the place absorb the break before I leave it behind. I drove back to the main street and parked and sat with the engine off as the sky began its transition from black to the deep blue that precedes Texas dawn. The dusty mile was dark. The feed store was dark. Mrs. Hatch's rooming house had one light in a rear window that I suspected was habitual, rather than responsive to the night's events. 2 federal vehicles passed through the main street at 4:40, heading toward the south end of town. Going for coal, most likely. The dusty miles. Bartender who had watched rooms and managed envelopes and denied names with prepared speed. I watched the vehicles pass and thought about Cole, who had been given an instruction and had followed it with professional consistency and would now discover that professional consistency has a limited protective value when the operation it served is being disassembled from the foundation up. The dawn came in the way Texas dawn comes, without subtlety or negotiation. One moment the street was blue dark, and the next it was lit with the flat certainty of a sun that has no patience for gradual. I got out of the car and walked the length of the main street one time. Past the feed store, past the post office, past the dusty mile with its sign that looked newer than it wanted to appear. In the full morning light, the building looked ordinary. Timber, single story, a bar that served drinks and other things to people who needed other things. I thought about what Redwell had been before the dusty mile arrived. A town of 400 with a feed store and a church, and the particular self-sufficiency of places that have learned not to require much from the outside world. Then something had appeared in its main street without anyone marking the arrival. Had installed itself in the town's daily rhythm so gradually that the rhythm had adjusted around it without the town noticing the adjustment. 400 people, and none of them could say when it had opened. That was the operation's most precise achievement. I stopped in front of the dusty mile and looked at the sign one more time. The Dusty Mile, a name that implied history, distance traveled, accumulated, experience, the kind of name an old establishment earns. This one had chosen it before earning anything, which was consistent with everything else about the operation, the appearance of legitimacy constructed before the legitimacy existed, worn, like a coat belonging to someone else and worn well enough that nobody checked the fit until someone arrived from outside the town and started asking questions. Mrs. Hatch was in her kitchen when I knocked on the back door. She received me with coffee and the same composure she had applied to my earlier, unscheduled appearance, which suggested her composure was a fixed quantity, independent of circumstances. I told her federal agents would likely want to speak with her today regarding the Dusty Mile and that she should tell them everything she knew, including her genuine uncertainty about when it had opened. She said she had always found honesty the most efficient policy. I believed her, completely. I paid my bill, which she had prepared and left on the kitchen table the previous morning, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew I would be, returning to settle it regardless of how the night developed. The amount was fair. I left something extra that she noticed and didn't mention, which is the correct response to something extra. I picked up my bag from the room with the window facing the main street and took one last look at the dusty mile from above. In the morning light, it casts a shadow. Every building casts a shadow. That one had taken longer than most to show its true length. The drive back to the city took most of the day. I stopped once for fuel and food at a place where the coffee was bad enough to be clarifying, and ate without tasting, and drove on through the flat Texas distance. I thought about the operation as a whole the way I think about cases when they're resolved but not finished processing. It had been built on the principle that a small town's isolation was an asset. Nobody looks at, read well, nobody asks when a saloon opened. Nobody maps the North Road or checks the property records of a county that produces nothing newsworthy. The operation had been right about all of that, until Sutter arrived to assess a property and found local conditions. Worth noting, in a final paragraph, that he couldn't quite bring himself to specify because he wasn't certain who might read it first. That single paragraph of careful vagueness had been enough. Cooper had sent it to me. Pam had flagged it in red. 3 red flags on a file that contained 4 words worth of actual alarm, buried in a routine assessment report from a man who had since been contained pending resolution. The phrase still sat badly. It was designed to. I reached the city as the evening came in and the rain started, which it did with the reliability of a city that takes its atmospheric responsibilities seriously. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off and the rain on the roof, and the case arranging itself into the version that gets filed rather than the version that gets lived. They are always different documents. The filed version has clean edges. The lived version has crane removing files in a lamplit warehouse, and Sutter moving through Texas's night on 2 days of water, and a town that forgot to notice when something arrived. Pam was at the office when I arrived, which I had stopped finding surprising and started finding necessary in the way you stop noticing things that have become structural. She had the final federal confirmation on the desk and coffee that was fresh, which meant she had timed my arrival with the accuracy she applies to everything. She looked at me the way she looks after cases that have involved Texas and warehouses and nights I don't fully account for. The look contains several things. I've learned to receive it without deflecting. She told me Aldred had been detained that afternoon at the firm Crane had named. The firm above the firm, the financial layer that the warehouse documents approached but didn't fully reach. Driscoll's team had used the firm name I had passed through Pam at 3 in the morning to move before Aldred could move first, which is the specific value of 48 hours becoming tonight. Aldred had been at his desk when they arrived, which Pam described as either confident or oblivious. She said she suspected the former. So did I. Cole had been detained at his residence, south of Redwell, before dawn. He had not resisted, which fit his character. A man who assesses and adapts would recognize a situation that had passed the point where adaptation remained available. Crane was in federal custody, and cooperating formally, which would determine his outcome over months, rather than days. The warehouse and its 2 sets of files were in federal custody, and would determine several other outcomes over the years that follow when operations of that size are fully unraveled. These things take time, longer than the building took, not as long as it deserves. I asked about the dusty mile itself. Pam said it had been formally closed and sealed by federal order that morning. A notice had been posted on the door She said the town of Redwell would likely find the closure less disorienting than expected, given that nobody could clearly remember the opening. There was a particular justice in that symmetry that I found satisfying without being able to fully articulate why. Some things arrive without being noticed and leave the same way. The difference is who arranged the departure. Sutter had given his formal account to federal investigators and been released to contact Cooper directly. Cooper had called the office twice. During the day, Pam said, with the frequency of a man who wanted to be informed and had been told to wait and found waiting structurally incompatible with his temperament. She had managed him with the patient efficiency she applies to clients who confuse urgency with usefulness. By the time he reached me directly, his questions had been reduced to the essential ones, which took 4 minutes to answer. He said he was grateful. He said it like a man settling a debt. I thought about the land parcel that had started the whole sequence, a piece of Redwell County ground that a development firm had wanted assessed, that an assessor had gone to examine and not returned from, that had been transferred through dissolved companies and manufactured titles as part of an operation using the county's isolation as raw material. The parcel itself was unremarkable, viable as Sutter had noted in his single report, just ground. The interest in it had never been the ground. It had been the documentation surrounding the ground. The ground was incidental to the paper built on top of it. Pan put my billing summary on the desk. It was thorough and accurate, and included the truck driver's fee in Mrs. Hatch's room and the coins spent on a gas station telephone at 3 a.m, which she had itemized. Because precision is not a function of scale for Pam, it is a function of principle. I signed the invoice for Cooper's firm and she handled the rest. Then we sat with the rain outside, and the case finished, and the office quiet in the way it gets when something has been resolved. And the resolution has not yet been replaced by the next thing, I told her, about the dusty mile in the morning light. The sign that looked newer than it wanted to appear. The way the building had cast a shadow like any other building once the sun was fully up. She listened with the quality of attention she gives things that aren't strictly operational, which is a different quality than her case attention, and in some ways more complete. She said that most things cast the right shadow eventually. You just have to be there when the light hits them correctly. I said that was either profound or obvious. She said most true things were. Both. The Redwell case closed officially 3 months later when the federal proceedings reached their first set of convictions. Aldred received the heaviest sentence, which was appropriate and insufficient simultaneously. The way sentences tend to be when the damage done has been distributed across years and jurisdictions and paper trails so carefully constructed that the full accounting takes longer than the crime. Crane received a reduced outcome in exchange for his cooperation, which the law permits, and which sits differently depending on where you were standing in that warehouse at 4 a.m. I read the conviction report in the office on a Tuesday morning and put it in the file and put the file in the cabinet, and poured 2 cups of coffee, one for me and one for Pam, who had just arrived and was removing her coat with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose day is already organized in her head and is simply waiting for her hands to catch up. She took the cup and looked at me over the rim with the expression she uses when she knows I've just closed something mentally and is giving me the moment to finish doing it. I finished, she said. What's next? I said. I'd let her know when it walked through the door. It always does.